The air was thick, heavy with tension that couldn't be touched, but was undeniable. Jason, his back hunched and eyes bloodshot from exhaustion, dropped the pizza box with a thud, sweat dripping down his forehead as a cold, cutting voice tore into him in front of his coworkers. "Are you saying you're late? Are you calling me a liar?" The accusation sliced through the room like a slap, humiliating the young man without mercy. But the worst part? The customer Jason had just delivered to, the one standing quietly in the corner, had no idea that this wasn't just any regular customer. This was the CEO, the owner, the man behind the pizza empire. And as Jason stood there, trying to hold back the shame, the air felt charged with something darker. What was happening in this store was bigger than one late pizza. It was a system on the brink of collapse. Have you ever been made to feel so small in your job that you just wanted to disappear? Or worse, been abandoned in your most critical moment? We've all been there, but what if the boss, the one person who could make a difference, finally decided to step up and do something about it? The truth is, not everything that glitters is gold, and sometimes, the strongest companies are built when the ugly truth comes to light. The rise of Jackson Reeves' pizza chain had been a testament to his vision, hard work, and relentless drive. What started as a small, humble walk-up window on the west side of Indianapolis had grown into a thriving pizza empire. Over 40 locations spread across the Midwest, each one a reflection of his dreams, his sacrifices, and his desire to make something lasting. His company was his pride, the physical manifestation of everything he had worked for. His life story could be told through the journey of his business, and for years, it had been a success story. A beacon of consistency, quality, and customer service, Jackson had built his business on the values he believed in. Doing things right, honestly, and consistently. It wasn't just about making pizza, it was about creating a community, a culture, a family within the workforce, and a place that customers could rely on. Before the cracks began to show, life at the company was simple. Employees worked hard, took pride in their work, and treated customers like they were part of the family. Jackson could walk into any store, and there would be no surprises. Just the smell of freshly baked pizza, the sound of laughter between staff, and the quiet hum of hard work. He knew his employees by name, they knew him, and together, they created something that felt real. There was a sense of order, of reliability, of mutual respect between the frontline workers and management. Employees were happy, customers returned, and things were good. But then, slowly, things began to slip. The cracks were subtle at first, slower than usual delivery times, a few complaints here and there about cold pizzas, or a missed topping. Jackson brushed them off as nothing more than occasional hiccups in a busy business. But soon, the complaints started coming in by the dozens. Sales were beginning to slide, and retention was dropping. Employees began calling in sick more often, and those who did show up seemed increasingly disgruntled. Staff turnover was high, and the quality of the service seemed to deteriorate. It wasn't just one bad week or one bad store. It was a pattern that was spreading through the company. Jackson could feel it in his gut. Something was wrong. The worst part was that his regional manager, Bradley, kept assuring him everything was under control. "We're doing fine," Bradley would say, "just a few bad weeks. It happens in this business." But Jackson knew better. He had built this company from the ground up, and he could feel when something was off. The numbers weren't just a few bad days. They were a glaring warning sign that something much deeper was at play. It wasn't just the reports on paper that concerned him, it was the fact that his employees were starting to look more like automatons than people. Jackson was a man who trusted his instincts. The numbers might have been off, but they didn't tell the whole story. He needed to see for himself. He couldn't just sit behind a desk and watch the slow decline from afar. He needed to understand the root cause, to get closer, to feel what his employees were experiencing. And so, with that in mind, Jackson decided to go undercover. He would disguise himself, order a pizza, and visit one of his own stores, store number 17, the one with the highest number of complaints. He had not made a public appearance in nearly 4 years, so most of the new employees had no idea what he looked like. It was risky, but it was also bold. He wanted to experience the store as a customer, not as a CEO. So, Jackson threw on a hoodie, a pair of worn-out jeans, some cheap reading glasses, and a brown wig that itched like hell. He wasn't trying to be incognito, he just wanted to look like a tired man ordering dinner, not the founder of a pizza empire. He placed the order through the app: large pepperoni, extra cheese. It was a simple order, and the expected delivery time was 30 minutes. He sat back on his couch, phone in hand, and waited. 30 minutes passed. Then 40. Then 50. He was about to give up, on the pizza, on the system he had built, and on everything. But then came the knock. When Jackson opened the door, he saw a young man standing there. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his uniform was wrinkled, showing the signs of an exhausting shift. The delivery driver, Jason, looked tired, worn out, like he had been working non-stop. But even in the state he was in, he managed a small, honest smile. "Sorry I'm late," Jason said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a rough night." Jackson took the box from Jason's hands, but before he could say anything, Jason spoke again. "I'm the only one working tonight. We were supposed to have 3 of us, but one quit, and the other called out. So it's just me." Jason's admission hit Jackson like a punch in the gut. One person, covering the entire district alone. And the worst part? Jason wasn't being compensated for it. "Are they paying you overtime at least?" Jackson asked, his voice slipping lower. Jason's smile faded. "Technically, yeah, but my manager cuts my hours on other days so I don't go over full-time. Says it's company policy." Jackson froze. That wasn't company policy. That was manipulation. It was a clear violation of the principles Jackson had built his company on. The reality of what was happening inside his stores, the exploitation of employees, the exploitation of the people who helped him build his dream, sank in. Jackson felt it like a weight in his chest. He wasn't angry, he was devastated. The values he had founded his company on were being trampled, and it was all happening right under his nose. But Jackson didn't walk away. He stood there, staring at Jason's face, and promised himself something was going to change. The moment Jackson had been dreading arrived just a few days later. After seeing Jason's exhaustion and hearing the truth about what was happening behind the scenes, he knew the time had come to confront the heart of the problem. His empire had been built on the sweat and hard work of people like Jason, and now it was collapsing under the weight of mismanagement, negligence, and a system that no longer cared for the people who made it all possible. Jackson didn't need the reports anymore. The reality was right in front of him. He had seen it in Jason's eyes, the fatigue, the resignation, the frustration. And it wasn't just Jason. The entire store was a ticking time bomb. He had heard about the manager, Rick Turner, the man who had been running store number 17 into the ground. Jackson knew Rick had been a problem for months, but it wasn't until now that the full extent of his failure became clear. Rick's toxic management style was destroying the employees' morale, driving them to quit or worse, to just give up. The humiliation, the disrespect, the abuse, it had all become a part of the culture of the store. And Jackson could no longer pretend it was an isolated issue. He had ignored the signs for too long. The complaints from customers had been stacking up, and the reviews were relentless. But what really struck him was the way the employees were being treated. Jackson had seen Jason, the delivery driver, being humiliated in front of everyone. He had seen the manager, Rick, berating a young employee for making a minor mistake. It was abuse masquerading as leadership, and it was hurting everyone involved. Jackson knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let this rot spread any further. The decisions he made next would shape the future of his business, and the future of the people who worked for him. That afternoon, Jackson walked into store number 17 again, this time without his disguise, no baseball cap, no wig. This time, he was there to take control. As he entered the store, the familiar smells of garlic and pizza dough filled the air, but something was different this time. The energy was off. The store was quiet, the staff looked drained, and there was an unmistakable tension hanging in the air. The employees were still working, but there was no enthusiasm, no drive. They weren't working for a sense of pride, they were just clocking in and out. Jackson's eyes scanned the room, and as soon as he walked up to the counter, he could see it. Alyssa, the young girl who had rung him up last time, didn't even look up. She handed over the pizza with a robotic motion, not acknowledging him in any way. The silence was deafening. A few feet away, Trey, the dough station worker, stood with his head down, clearly trying to avoid any confrontation. There was no sense of camaraderie in the air, no unity. Then he heard it, a shout from the back. The same stocky, angry voice that had once roared through the thin walls. Rick Turner. The man Jackson had come to confront. "This dough is garbage." Rick's voice thundered. "I've told you 3 times how to do it right. Do it wrong again, and you can stay here until closing." There was no respect, no guidance, just pure authoritarianism. Jackson's stomach churned. He had seen enough. It wasn't just Rick's cruelty that disgusted him, it was the way everyone seemed to accept it, as though this was normal. There were no protests, no outbursts. The employees had learned to take it in silence, to swallow their pride and bear it. That was the kind of place this store had become. And then Jason walked in. His face was pale, his eyes heavy with the weight of yet another shift. Jackson watched as he shuffled into the store, his body language defeated, every step heavy with exhaustion. As soon as Jason appeared, Rick's eyes locked on him, and Jackson could feel the tension rise. "You're late," Rick snapped as Jason approached the counter, his words like venom. Jason looked confused. "No, I'm not. I was scheduled for noon," he replied, trying to stand his ground. Rick, however, wasn't having it. "I told you to come in at 11 o'clock. Don't play dumb." Jason said nothing, but Jackson saw it, the way he stood there, frozen, not in defiance but in quiet acceptance. This wasn't a man trying to fight back. This was a man who had been beaten down by the system for so long that he no longer had the energy to argue. His silence spoke louder than any words. Jackson's blood boiled. This wasn't just a management problem, this was a cultural issue. Rick wasn't just a bad manager. He was a part of the machine that had turned this store, this company, into something unrecognizable. And that's when it hit Jackson. This wasn't just about firing Rick. This was about fixing a broken system. It wasn't just one bad manager, it was the entire culture that allowed this to happen. The disrespect, the manipulation of hours, the mistreatment of employees. It had to stop. Jackson couldn't stand by any longer and let it fester. With a calm but steady stride, Jackson stood up from the booth where he had been quietly watching. The store fell silent, and every eye turned toward him. Rick, still oblivious to who Jackson was, snapped at him, "You need something?" His voice was thick with irritation. Jackson's eyes met Rick's. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady and cold. "I need you to explain to me why you're treating my employees like this." Rick's face froze. The room seemed to stop breathing. Alyssa looked up from the register, her eyes wide. Jason stiffened, his face a mixture of confusion and hope. It wasn't just Jackson's words that had cut through the room, it was the realization that something was finally changing. Jackson's voice rang out clear and sharp as he pulled off his baseball cap, revealing himself to the man who had been running the store into the ground for months. "Recognize me now?" Jackson asked, his words final and unwavering. Rick's face drained of color. His mouth hung open, and for the first time in months, he looked small, powerless. And in that moment, Jackson knew. This wasn't just about correcting one mistake. It was about fixing the entire culture of the company. It was about leading with respect, dignity, and understanding, rather than with fear. And it was about giving his employees the respect they deserved, starting now. The silence in the store was deafening. Every employee, every customer, and even Rick Turner himself seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Jackson to make his next move. The air crackled with tension, a moment suspended in time, and in that silence, Jackson felt something change. It wasn't just about Rick anymore. It was about what the store, what the company had become, and what it could still be. Rick, still staring at Jackson in disbelief, sputtered, "I didn't know it was you, Mr. Reeves. I didn't mean." But Jackson didn't let him finish. "Don't." Jackson's voice was sharp, cutting through the uncertainty that hung between them. "You didn't know? That's the problem. You didn't know because you've been running this store into the ground without any accountability. And now I'm here, and you're going to explain to me how you've been treating my people." Rick's face flushed a deep red. The arrogance that had once marked his leadership was now replaced by a mix of fear and confusion. He couldn't speak, his mouth moved, but no words came out. Jackson's eyes didn't leave Rick's, and his voice, now calm and controlled, filled the air with authority. You've been cutting hours to avoid paying overtime, manipulating schedules, and treating your employees like disposable commodities. That's not leadership, that's exploitation. And it ends now. Rick, who had once walked around the store barking orders with an iron fist, suddenly seemed small. The man who had humiliated his employees, belittled them, and torn down their spirits now stood before Jackson, utterly powerless. Jackson had seen enough. He didn't need to hear any excuses. The damage had been done. The toxic environment that Rick had cultivated in this store, the culture of fear, the neglect of workers, had to go. This wasn't just about Rick's firing, it was about setting a new precedent. It was about leadership rooted in respect and understanding, not in intimidation. "You're done here," Jackson said, his voice cold and final. "Pack your things. You're fired." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Rick didn't move. He stood there, as if processing what was happening, trying to comprehend the sudden shift in power. But Jackson wasn't done. "And don't worry, I'll make sure to clean up the mess you left behind." Rick's face twisted with anger, and his fists clenched, but Jackson didn't flinch. He had made up his mind. There was no going back. "You think firing me will fix everything?" Rick spat, his voice bitter. "You'll never be able to clean up this mess. This store's been a disaster for months, and now you're just going to sweep it under the rug." Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "You're right," he said quietly, his tone unwavering. "But I'm not here to sweep anything under the rug. I'm here to start over. And I'm going to make sure this store works the way it was meant to." Rick's shoulders slumped, and he stormed out, slamming the office door behind him. For the first time in months, the room felt different. The oppressive weight that had hung over the employees now lifted, replaced by a strange sense of anticipation. Jackson stood there for a moment, alone in the office, the door still swinging on its hinges. He had taken the first step, but now came the harder part, the rebuilding. He couldn't just fire Rick and call it a day. He couldn't just fix the problem with a quick decision. Jackson knew that true change wouldn't come from a single confrontation. It would take time, effort, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. He turned to the employees, who had gathered at the front of the store, watching him. Jason, Alyssa, Trey, they were all there, their faces a mixture of hope and skepticism. Jackson took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what to say, but something inside him told him it was time for a different kind of speech. He walked up to the counter, and for the first time, he felt like he wasn't just an outsider in his own company. He felt like a part of something real. Something that mattered. "This store has been run the wrong way for a long time," Jackson said, his voice steady. "That ends today. We're going to rebuild this store, but not just the store, everything. We're going to treat each other with respect, we're going to work together, and we're going to make sure that every employee here feels like they matter." Jason, standing near the front, looked at Jackson with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "You really mean that?" he asked quietly, almost as if he couldn't believe someone at the top cared enough to actually listen. Jackson nodded. "I do. From now on, no more cutting corners. No more manipulation. I'm going to be here, in the trenches with you all. No more hiding behind a desk." The words hung in the air, a promise, an unspoken vow that things would be different. But what Jackson didn't know was that his words, his actions, had already started to spark a shift. The employees weren't just hearing him, they were starting to believe him. And that was the twist. The true turning point wasn't in the firing of Rick Turner, but in the realization that Jackson wasn't just a CEO. He was a leader. And the people in this store were ready to follow him, not because he had authority, but because he had earned their trust. Jason, who had been beaten down by the system, was starting to see the potential for something better. And, unbeknownst to Jackson, the shift he had started would go far beyond this one store. This was the beginning of a revolution, one where employees could finally feel like they mattered. And that was only the start. The day after Rick Turner's abrupt departure, something in the air had shifted. Jackson could feel it as soon as he stepped back into store number 17. The energy was different, subdued, but no longer heavy with dread. The employees moved with purpose, their movements slightly more confident, their faces less burdened. It was as if the weight of years of mistreatment had been lifted, and though it wasn't gone completely, there was a noticeable change. Jason, who had been walking with his shoulders hunched like a man carrying the world on his back, now stood straighter. His movements weren't as stiff, and when he spoke to the rest of the team, his voice had more conviction. Alyssa, the young girl behind the register, seemed to carry herself with more assurance. She smiled more, genuinely this time, offering customers more warmth than the cold indifference she had shown just days earlier. But Jackson knew that this was just the beginning. Firing Rick had been necessary, but it wasn't enough to fix everything. The real work was just beginning. He wasn't naive enough to think that firing one toxic manager would fix an entire culture. The store wasn't healed yet. Jackson's mind raced with 1,000 things that needed to be done. He had seen the broken schedules, the manipulative practices, and the exhaustion etched on his employees' faces. He couldn't fix it overnight, but he was committed to giving it everything he had. Jackson stayed involved, more than he ever had before. He didn't just send emails or approve budgets from a distance. He spent hours in the store, working alongside his staff. He answered phones, folded boxes, and even made deliveries with Jason. He showed them that he wasn't just the CEO. He was someone who cared about the people behind the pizza, and he was there to do the work, not to command from above. In the weeks that followed, things began to change more drastically than anyone had expected. Employees who had once been burnt out and defeated began to show signs of hope. Jason, who had been ready to leave the company just days before, now found himself taking on new responsibilities. Jackson had offered him a chance to manage the store, and although Jason was hesitant at first, the transformation was undeniable. Jackson didn't rush Jason into the role. Instead, he gave him the space to grow into it. He knew Jason wasn't just looking for a title, he was looking for the chance to make a difference. And Jackson believed he had the heart and the work ethic to do just that. So, he stood by him, offering guidance when needed, but never forcing anything. The trust they had built was genuine. But not everyone was on board with the change. Some employees, particularly those who had been around for longer, were skeptical. They had seen too many promises broken, too many new beginnings that ended in disappointment. There was a quiet resistance in the air, an unspoken doubt that lingered among the staff. Jackson had anticipated this. He knew it wasn't enough to just fire Rick and implement new policies. The real work was in rebuilding trust, and that was the hardest part. A few weeks after Rick had left, Jackson called a team meeting. He had made it clear that the store was under new management, but now he needed to ensure the team felt it, too. Standing in front of the group, he felt the weight of their eyes on him. "I know some of you are skeptical," Jackson said, his voice steady. "And I don't blame you. You've been let down before. But I want to tell you this, what happened here before, the way things were run, that's not the way we're going to do things anymore. You deserve better, and I'm here to make sure you get it." The room was quiet for a long moment, the weight of Jackson's words sinking in. Then, slowly, Jason stood up. He didn't say anything at first, but his eyes locked on Jackson's. He nodded, a subtle shift, a sign that he was on board. "We're in this together," Jason said simply. The others looked around at each other, and slowly, they nodded too. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. The seeds of change had been planted. But even with the progress, not all was perfect. Jackson knew that no matter how many policies he put in place, there would always be challenges. The company was still recovering from the damage Rick had done, and trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. As Jackson sat in his office later that night, the quiet hum of the pizza ovens from Store 17 still echoing in his ears, he reflected on everything that had happened. The firing of Rick had been the necessary first step, but it wasn't the end. The real challenge was creating a culture where employees felt valued, where they knew their voices mattered. And while the road ahead would be difficult, Jackson was committed to seeing it through. The true consequences of Rick's firing weren't just the immediate improvements at Store 17. They were felt across the entire company. Word had spread fast that Jackson wasn't just a CEO who hid behind a desk, he was a leader who was willing to fight for his people. And in doing so, he set the tone for the future of his company. This was no longer just about sales or expansion. It was about building a company that was rooted in integrity and respect. Over the following months, Jackson made sure to visit more stores. He didn't want to be the kind of CEO who was only seen when there was a crisis. He wanted to be present, to listen, to ensure that the culture he had started building in Store 17 would spread throughout the company. As Jackson watched the transformation unfold, he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. Leadership isn't about fixing everything. It's about giving people the tools, the support, and the space to fix things for themselves. It's about trust. And as the employees of Store 17 continued to thrive, he knew that the change he had begun would last, because it wasn't just about policies. It was about people. Jackson's journey wasn't just about fixing a store or firing a bad manager. It was about discovering what true leadership looks like. It's not about sitting in a high office, making decisions from a distance. It's about showing up, listening, and caring for the people who make the business what it is. The change at Store 17 wasn't an overnight miracle. It took time, effort, and real commitment. But if there's one thing Jackson learned from this experience, it's that true transformation starts with one decision: to stand up and do the right thing. To choose respect over authority, understanding over control. This story is a reminder that leadership isn't just about making the tough calls. It's about listening to your team, empowering them, and setting an example. We all have the power to lead from where we stand, whether it's in a company, a community, or our own lives. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever worked for a leader who made you feel valued? Or, have you been in a toxic environment where change felt impossible? Share your thoughts with us. Let's start a conversation about leadership, respect, and the power of showing up. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who's ever been treated like they don't matter at work. Let's remind people that real leadership isn't a title, it's the action behind it.